Throughout the election cycle, polls are released practically every day showing who is more likely to win the presidency.
At a poll in the field starting on Friday night.
Polls showing the president standing among older voters.
And then there's consideration of whether the polls are even right.
Despite the amount of polls we see out there, according to a 2018 The Hill-Harris X poll, a majority of Americans don't believe polls are accurate, even though polling has become more and more accurate over time.
Polls are a story, but you can't just take the headline. You have to read the entire story.
Most of the polls that grab headlines are political polls, but most election polls are not meant to make money.
So the only people cashing in on polls are the in-house campaign strategists.
Instead, they're considered free advertising to attract new clients for private firms and prospective students to universities.
People see that you're doing these pollings, and then you can get clients to do market research, image evaluations that are a significantly greater proportion of their work.
Polling is part of a much larger industry of market research, worth over $19 billion in the US alone. So how reliable are political polls, and how is the industry changing? The 2016 election shook people's confidence in polls, as most said that Hillary Clinton would win the presidency. Polls have gotten more accurate over time as technologies improve, and the polls were right in terms of the popular vote in 2016, when they were off by about 2 points. But
polls don't poll the Electoral College, we poll populations. What happened is the polls were basically accurate at the national level, but there were some state polls that consistently showed Hillary Clinton with a lead that she didn't end up having in the end.
Polls in states like Michigan also called the Democratic primary for Clinton, but the state went to Senator Bernie Sanders by 1.5%. In post-mortems after the election, there were theories that polls were biased.
White voters without a college degree voted significantly more Republican than white voters with a college degree. We had never seen that phenomenon before like that.
It also speaks to other biases that polling can have.
Sample sizes of racial and ethnic minorities in these polls are not large, and the cross sections are small. What tends to happen is that the individuals who are in communities of color that respond to surveys are individuals that are more high education leaning, right? And so if that's all we're basing the sample off of, then we already expect these individuals to turn out.
To make a sample more representative of the population as a whole,
weighting the survey data on certain characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender, age, and education to help make sure that we're benchmarking our sample against what we know to be U.S. Census data.
So what should you look for when looking at polls? Polling experts agree that transparency about the methodology is key when looking at polls.
You have to ask those questions about who was sampled, about the question wording, the question order, if that's available. You have to know when the survey was conducted. There are so many questions that don't get answered immediately with just a one paragraph read or a scan of the survey.
And the click here for more details, clicking it. Most of these surveys will actually, in their top line report, which is what the link usually goes to, will break down some of their responses to questions by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by age, by partisanship, so that you can understand, where individuals that might have similar group identities as you, where they fall on some of these questions that they're reporting.
The polling and market research industry helps brands and politicians gain insight into what constituents and target demographics are thinking at a particular moment in time.
Public affairs polling is usually an arm of a news media organization, the Pew Foundation or Gallup, independent, nonpartisan groups that are doing polling. That's a very small universe.
According to the U.S. Census, in 1998, market research and public polling firms made over $9.7 billion. 20 years later, in 2018, the industry grew to over $19 billion, an annualized growth of about 3.5%. When adjusted for inflation, the real growth was about 1.24%. Worldwide, the industry made about $49 billion in revenue, according to ASMR and BDO. Candidates spent big on polling firms in 2016. According to the FEC, Donald Trump spent almost $4 million in polling. Hillary Clinton spent more than $10 million. The biggest players in the industry globally are market research companies that have internal public opinion departments within their ranks. The largest of these companies by far is Nielsen Holdings plc, most famously known for their TV rating systems. The company's revenue was $6.5 billion in 2019. Closing out the top 3 companies in the U.S. by worldwide revenue are IQVIA with about $4.4 billion in revenue in 2019, and Gartner Research with an estimated revenue of $3.3 billion in 2019. Many of the more well-known polling houses are within universities. The main difference between university polls and private firms is where they get their funding and the required review process. University pollsters are usually funded through grants and donations, while private firms are for profit and usually have candidates or parties as clients.
At the university, you have to clear an institutional review board. You have to show them the survey, and this review board says, well, this question might be traumatic for someone to answer. And so they work with the scholar who's writing the survey, and they have to change it.
That doesn't mean that professional pollsters don't have high standards.
You can be guaranteed that if they're doing a political poll, they're going to have a pair of conservative-oriented eyes on it and a pair of liberal-oriented eyes on it, because you need people playing devil's advocate. You need people trying to dissect what the question might possibly generate.
There are so many pollsters out there doing political polls that it may be hard to figure out which ones are trustworthy. But there are tools to help with that. The website 538 has a pollster rating system that calculates the polling error, statistical bias, and how many races each pollster called correctly to give each of them a letter grade. The 6 pollsters with an A+ rating are Marist College, Monmouth University, ABC News Washington Post, Siena College, New York Times Upshot, Seltzer & Company, and Muhlenberg College. SurveyMonkey and Swayable have D- ratings, the lowest grade before 538 bans pollsters from their aggregations. It would be almost impossible to poll every adult in the United States, so pollsters sample a certain amount of people that represent the population being studied. You may think that the more people who take a survey or answer a poll will make it more accurate and representative, but that's not necessarily true.
It's not a sample size that's representative, it's the sampling that makes it representative.
Sampling can be divided into 2 categories: probability and non-probability sampling.
Probability samples are based on everyone having a known chance of being included in the sample. Thinking about a pot of chili, right? We don't have to taste the entire pot to know the chili is good and evenly balanced. We only need a few small tastes or samples. And so the same is true of public opinion.
If it's a scientific sample and a good sample, you will be able to generalize back to the population from which the respondents were drawn with that margin of error around it.
The margin of error is how wrong a poll can be, but it's more than that.
If we were to take a poll of 1,000 registered voters in Pennsylvania, the survey results would say something along the lines of, the results of this survey are accurate at the 95% confidence level, plus or minus 3 points. And the plus or minus 3 points simply tells us that if we were to ask the same questions on another sample of 1,000 voters, that we can be confident that the results will be within 3 percentage points of the true population value.
While probability samples are traditional, they are becoming more and more expensive to conduct, so there is a trend away from them to non-probability sampling.
We're allowing people generally on the internet to tell us they want to participate in polls. Now, if you can ever get to the point where everybody wants to be part of polls, it wouldn't matter. It's going to be representative.
It used to be there wasn't a very good way to really do non-probability sampling, but now with online methods where you can basically recruit millions of people, we have much more sophisticated ways to do non-probability sampling than we did just 10 years ago.
As more people let go of their landlines for cell phones, response rates have dropped from around 36% in 1997 to 6% in 2018.
The problem that we're getting is that more and more people just simply don't want to talk to somebody that they don't know or won't pick up the phone to even see who's on the other end. And that simply has driven up the cost. That has been the biggest challenge.
In election polling, you have 3 kinds of polls: benchmark, heat trials, and exit polls.
A benchmark survey is one in which a candidate might decide that he or she is going to run for office. So they ask questions such as, what do you think is the most important problem facing the nation today, or this city or this state? Have you ever heard of candidate's name? And they use this as a baseline.
Trial heat polls are the ones we see throughout the election cycle, asking about specific races or issues. And most reputable pollsters take great care to make sure that they are not priming a respondent's answer.
Instead of asking, for whom would you vote, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, you asked, for whom would you vote, the incumbent, President Donald Trump, or challenger Joe Biden? Or you could ask, for whom would you vote, Republican Donald Trump or Democrat Joe Biden. So notice how the words that are included now trigger people to think a certain way. They're primed.
Exit polling is done outside of election centers. Polling houses recruit hundreds or even thousands of people to conduct interviews as people leave their polling place.
We've done a lot of work before you see it. Like the short part is putting it in the field and analyzing the data. The long part is, putting it together.
After the poll is conducted, the data is analyzed and then weighted to make up for any lack of representation.
First and foremost, you want to make sure the overall results are representative of everybody. So you bring up groups that are too low in your sample, and then you want to try to make sure that if you're looking at that group in particular, that it's going to be representative of that group. And then ideally, if you can, you want to be able to break out that group by age and gender within that group. So it depends how far you want to go with your analysis, how much you have to do.
The polling industry is going through changes as phone response rates go down and as non-probability sampling on the internet improves. As more internet polls are conducted, questions about representation come up.
We're not getting less diverse, less racially and ethnically diverse. We're getting more racially and ethnically diverse. And we can really no longer afford to collapse any of these variables or any of these samples into white, non-white, and then look at opinion and behavior.
Another concern for the industry is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or TCPA, which prohibits calling cell phones with automated machines, which also raises the price of conducting probability sampling.
Depending on whether you do a telephone poll or an online poll or text message polling or whatever, the cost can vary significantly, but you're talking about thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of dollars for a standard poll.
One way pollsters are getting around that is by emailing and texting the people on their list to do the poll that way, creating hybrid models to increase their response rates. There has also been a move for surveys and polls to social media and opt-in panels, but results from those polls should be taken cautiously.
Polling can actually serve as a counterpoint to this kind of bubble that's formed on social media that people think this is what everybody's talking about. And then polling can kind of set you right and say, no, that's not what everybody's talking about. You're just a small proportion of the public that are existing in that.
But polling firm clients are wanting to use these methods more since they are cheaper to conduct.
We have to look beyond telephone research for what's going to be the next thing and invest our brain trusts within the organization and making those things work. And they are less expensive. Certainly clients that want to do national public opinion polling or any particular subgroup in particular that can be hard to reach on a telephone wants to use panels. So there's a lot of pressure to do it, and the money's coming in for that kind of research.
How valid are these panels based on the individuals that opt in, especially when you're thinking about, internet surveys and the issues we have pertaining to the digital divide.
While those divides have been in the forefront during the COVID-19 crisis, some pollsters have actually gotten better response rates as people stay home.
We're getting a lot more success in people picking up their cell phones at different times of the day. So, and people actually wanted to talk to us. So our response rates actually popped up just a little bit.
The polling landscape is changing as people remain skeptical of polls. However, pollsters suggest that a robust public polling industry is a marker of a free society.
Most people think, the true mark of democratic health is how many people turn out to vote. And people say, oh my word, how can you live in a country where there are only 32% of its residents voting? But if you think about countries where you have 99, 100% voting, these are totalitarian states where you have to go and vote. So the idea of polling, the practice of polling, is a sign of democratic health, and it will not go away.